Welcome back to the Urban Legends season of Back Away Slowly, specifically the second half of the Vanishing Hitchhiker. Last week was a lot of information. I had to trim down a bunch of stories, and I'm gonna have to summarize the story elements as well. But we'll take a look at the story's tropes and why they're still so popular. And then we have an international trip planned. So let's get started. In terms of location, it'd probably take less time to list the states where the Vanishing Hitchhiker doesn't hang out. While the hitchhiker is frequently picked up roadside, they're always near or heading to a large city. Country road, open highway, street corner, this ghost doesn't give a damn. The weather's almost always rainy, snowy, or otherwise bad, which helps narratively as it persuades the motorist to stop for the drenched hitchhiker, as well as embellishing a spooky setting. Despite the ghost occasionally being male, the hitchhiker being a woman is pivotal. In a good number of the stories, the only detail we get about the hitchhiker is that she's a woman. There only seem to be two types of women in this story, for the most part. A beautiful young girl, sometimes with extra details like a thin evening dress or clothes clinging to her body, or an enfeebled old woman. Her clothes are either white, implying her ghostly nature or purity, or black, perhaps referencing a shroud or death clothes. Though, this ghost is unusual, as it seems to be an innocent victim of circumstance. At least from what we hear, she seems to have done nothing to deserve her death. When ghosts are given a reason for why they're a ghost at all, there tends to be something in their behavior, life choices, or even a betrayal, given as a reason for their loop in purgatory. But in the UK, there's more variety in the tragic circumstance of the ghost's existence. A UK version from 1977 lists the ghost as a man hung by a corrupt judge, the spirit of an American serviceman who died in a car crash, or an innocent man hanged for murder. Quote, loving husbands, caring mothers, and beautiful daughters. The message is the same. These are tragic figures, spirits worthy of your pity. And most often, the story is one of the most tragic of circumstances. A beautiful, promising young girl killed right in the middle of her transition from child to adult. This, combined with a fair number of stories giving the spirit an armful of books, a suitcase, or something else to carry, they're the ultimate pitiable soul. It makes us, as the listeners, more inclined to understand why the driver would pick up a stranger. This ghost also isn't shy when it comes to being witnessed. Many versions note that they've been seen by dozens of people. The driver's frequently accompanied by one or more companions as well, so the ghost isn't really concerned about being outnumbered. A traveling couple, taxi driver, a lone rider, salesman, a pair of friends. It's quite the variety. It's also a kind of unsettling premise. So many of the stories have a young girl climbing into a car with two men. It puts me on the wrong foot. Times have changed, that's for sure. Hitchhiking isn't exactly a contemporary topic anymore. We have more awareness of crimes and their circumstances. But even if we go back decades, I don't know how many young girls would have accepted a drive from one man, let alone two. And yes, I know she's already dead, but maybe that's what makes it more unsettling. Maybe it's a hint at her true nature, that she knows that there's really nothing that they can do to her. The conversation between the ghost and the driver spans from the hitchhiker only giving the address and insisting on silence to hours of pleasant conversation. It seems to depend on the preference of the ghost. When it comes to the ride itself, the hitchhiker usually sits in the backseat of the car. This provides a reason for why the driver doesn't immediately notice their passenger's absence. It also allows for the possibility that the young lady could have just stepped out of the car. When it comes to the vehicle, the most popular is, naturally, a car. However, we've also seen horse-drawn buggies and a bus. Other iterations also use a mail wagon and even a San Francisco cable car. When the ghost leaves something behind, the items vary quite a bit. While there's the usual book or suitcase, Outliers include a basket, purse, blanket, sweater, scarf, and even a bicycle. An item being included in the story is for the purpose of proof. It tells the narrator and the listener that the girl was in the car, that the driver didn't imagine her disappearance, and that something paranormal is going on. Other forms of proof include water spots on the seat or wet footprints in or around the car. The spirit accepting and temporarily stealing an object, like a coat, also prompts the driver to track down answers. It's easy for a listener to suggest that the driver should just go home. Why even go back to this stranger's house, a person that they met for less than an hour? Well, now the driver has no choice but to return to the home or graveyard, taking one step closer to discovering the truth, and thereby also moving the plot along. The fascinating thing about the reveal of the supernatural is that in the majority of the tellings, the driver doesn't actually witness the disappearance, leaving room for skepticism. It's the input from the family members that firmly cements the truth that this was a ghost. As reported in The Vanishing Hitchhiker by Beardsley and Hankey, out of 53 versions, it's only in 2 of those stories where the disappearance is actually witnessed. But what killed her? Usually it's a car accident, either being in a car that crashed or struck by a car when walking. Many stories suggest that she's tethered to the place of her death, requiring living interference to take her elsewhere. In situations like Resurrection Mary, the ghost gets a lot more active, darting across the road in a kind of repetitive imprint, repeating the memory of her death. In rarer but more interesting versions, the hitchhiker interferes with the car itself, stopping the driver from suffering her own fate, like in the story where the ghost pulls the emergency brake right at the spot where she was struck and killed. In the most unique stories, the cause of death varies from being tossed out of the car by an angry lover to freezing to death on the way home. Then there's the iteration where the girl's killed in a grove of trees by an angry lover, a sick girl stuck in a house fire, another dying of carbon monoxide poisoning, a man that's stuffed into a barrel and rolled down a hill, a lady cemented into a barn floor. The list gets really weird. Okay, so we have all of the story info that we could possibly want. Now it's time to take it back, to try to find the inspiration and origin of this tragic girl. When it comes to the story itself, its simplicity has definitely contributed to its longevity. Because it's so bare bones, anyone can tell it. Anyone can add whatever details are relevant to them personally, or their cultural area, allowing it to bob and weave into different economic classes. This kind of, quote, streamlined skeleton contains the plot points that most people remember, allowing it to survive for centuries. The search for the story's origin is almost impossible. It's simply so old, and retellings have varied so much across so many countries that it's incredibly difficult to trace through time. The fuzzy and ever-shifting edges of the story also allow it to morph together with other legends. So while I can't claim to have found the original story, we'll look at some that certainly share elbow room with The Vanishing Hitchhiker. One early interpretation was from the 1890s in the small town of Delmar, New York. There were stories of a ghost rider, a young woman who leaps onto the back of a young man's horse, sitting just behind him as he rides through a certain set of woods near Delmar. The young men are often riding to a party, and the young woman would disappear upon their arrival. Those local to the area concluded that she was, quote, a jealous one. Whether that was jealous of the men or jealous of going to the party, I don't know. But either way, she never harmed the men, and no one seemed to know her. The reveal of the supernatural eventually followed a pattern, but let's go back to the oldest tradition first. Thebes, Illinois, the late 1800s. A mail carrier buggy drawn by a horse picks up a woman, possibly a relative depending on the telling, and takes her into town. After a while, the driver looks over at her, but she isn't there. He realizes they just crossed a flowing stream, and, according to European folkloric tradition, spirits can't pass flowing water. Some trace this tradition all the way back to the river Styx of Greek mythology. You see, the river Styx was believed to be a boundary between the living and the dead, and the only way you were getting across was if you had payment for Charon, the pilot of the river Styx. This responsibility rested on the shoulders of the remaining living family. They needed to place a coin beneath the tongue of the deceased so that they'd have it to pay Charon. No coin, no afterlife. Another story type that was merging with Vanishing Hitchhiker reports was the ghost in search of help for a dying man. A traveler would be approached by someone on the street, who'd beg them to accept, quote, an errand of mercy. This usually meant that the traveler would need to find and bring a doctor or priest to a mortally sick person. The traveler and their potentially life-saving company would eventually arrive too late, discovering that this plea had come from the dead person themselves, looking to find a way to save their own life or to obtain final rites from the priest. The most famous version of this was published in St. Petersburg in December of 1890. Other reports came from London in 1942 and a Vanishing Hitchhiker story in 1932, where the hitchhiker is an old woman trying to get to the bedside of her dying son. It's quite a sad and touching story, that of a dead parent trying to comfort and guide her son into the afterlife with her. Some folklorists have zeroed in on the stories of old women carrying baskets, trying to find the legend's history from there. In German folklore, there's a spirit that masquerades as an elderly woman carrying a basket at the roadside. Farmers offer to give her a ride, but as soon as she climbs aboard, the horses can't pull the wagon. This has more of an air of mischief than anything else, and no harm comes to anyone in the story. Trying to track back the Vanishing Hitchhiker with stories of women giving prophecies or warnings, now that list goes back to the 1st century AD at least. But if you've studied the history of ghosts, the Vanishing Hitchhiker is very unusual in terms of how ghosts are viewed in the modern day. Most of us grew up with ghosts that were wispy and ethereal, immediately identifiable as not of this world, as not human. However, in the Victorian era and before, ghosts were solid and looked like living people. There would have to be an event that happened or information that was given to identify the living-looking person as a ghost. It was arguably during the obsession with spirit photography that ghosts started to look translucent in the public consciousness. But the Vanishing Hitchhiker ghost is actively masquerading as a living person. It's actively trying to fool the driver. So this story is a very unique relic of what ghosts were for centuries. Folklorist and professor Heather Joseph Witham explains this connection a bit more.
There's all sorts of these, the spirit world is either at unrest or wants to share prophecy with you, but that you don't know that they're a spirit at the time until they disappear or until the next day, which is really common with real ghost stories. If you talk to people who've seen ghosts, frequently they were just talking to someone and that someone disappeared and they thought they were solid. They looked just like a person. So, which, begs the question, how many times any of us have seen a spirit if they just look like people?
I can't think of any other stories where the spirit has to prove that they're a ghost, but they can't do it directly. They can't seem to control their ghostly abilities. They need the news to be delivered by a living person, or maybe they just like a dramatic reveal. But again, who are these girls? The vast majority of these stories feature a very young lady, but why? On one hand, it seems to be a quick way to convince the listener of the tragedy of their death. They're so young, they can't possibly have done anything wrong, could they? It suggests that they died, quote, before they could enjoy some simple human pleasure, a dance, fatherhood, marriage, a family reunion, homecoming, and so on. The versions where the spirit participates in the dance certainly gives a stronger bittersweet aftertaste. One of a girl who had barely started to realize who she was, what she liked, or who she wanted to be. And, of course, there are so many interpretations of the meaning around what the girl's wearing. Quite a few stories describe how, quote, flimsy and inappropriate the dresses are. On one hand, this could just be a way to earn sympathy from a passing driver, or to give the driver a justification for giving her their coat, a coat they would later have to find. The dresses are always very feminine, either in color or form. A pale lavender dress, an evening gown, a thin white evening dress, a light summer dress, a long sheer white dress. Beardsley and Hankey theorized that all of this white was suggestive to the etherealness of the ghost's true nature. However, Gillian Bennett suggests that these white, feminine dresses were meant to represent the girl's virginity and purity. The extra evidence for Bennett's theory is that a number of the Vanishing Hitchhiker stories say that the girl dies on the eve of her wedding, a forever bride. This leaves them stuck between childhood and adulthood. Quote, "It would be easy to see these sparkling creatures as having died between youthful virginity and adult sexuality, the dance or wedding being the transition zone, either symbolic or actual. Their haunting could then be read as a persistent endeavor to break out of their betwixt and between situation and find rest, either by being incorporated into the future that should have awaited them, or by being taken back to the pre-separation state of home and family." Gail DeVos's book, What Happens Next, describes a gender bias when it comes to what's viewed as the, quote, pitiable dead as discovered by Jeannie Thomas during her research of cemeteries. A vast majority of prominent grave markers feature young, beautiful women, regardless of the deceased person's age at the time of death. When it's a statue of a man, they seem to closely resemble the person buried at their feet. Quote, "Garbed in business suits, they are not beautiful, naked, sensual, or eye-catching. Many are crafted and placed to indicate the prestige of the person whose grave they mark. Women are imagined as their most idealized form or potential, pure and spotless, whereas men are featured as they are, or as close to the ideal of strength as they can get." And then we come to the most predictable conclusion, that she deserves this. Yes, I know what I said, that the dead girl's youth suggests unforeseeable tragedy. But is it a tragedy for her as a person? Or is it a tragedy for her honor? And just like that, the story shifts from a horrible accident to a cautionary tale. I mean, after all, the girl hitchhiked, allowing herself to be picked up by a male stranger. Come on, she was putting herself at risk of losing her greatest asset, her virtue. Alan Dundes argues that this is alluded to in the stories where a wet spot is left on the car's back seat, quote, "a well-known locus of teenage and even preteen necking and petting." Dundes goes on to explain that teens gain access to a, quote, "potential mobile bedroom" when they start driving. After all, souped-up cars are called, quote, "hot rods," which, Dundes writes, are fraught with phallic overtones. Quote, "Moreover, and this is critical, a girl who allows herself to be picked up in this way can never go home again. In more explicit terms, a girl who has once lost her chastity is punished for all eternity by trying desperately, though to no avail, to return to the sanctity of home with all its associations of family values." So yeah, it's super fun to read about how many cultures for countless centuries have seen a girl's only true value as her virginity. According to this perspective, she deserves to relive her death, endlessly trying to return to her loved ones because she didn't guard her virtue close enough, which is also always her fault, by the way. I did notice that these stories almost never mention sexual contact, but it doesn't really seem to matter. According to Dundes' theory, she made the wrong decision one time with the wrong driver. And now, she's doomed forever. Let's backtrack to talk about restless spirits in general. Gillian Bennett connected the behavior of the ghosts to the ancient belief that ghosts must return to their graves before the cockcrow, or dawn. While we've seen that tradition with creatures like vampires, even older customs hold that this is also true of ghosts. Though we touched on the victim-blaming implications of the lore, Bennett still asks the question, why are the ghosts of innocent people now doomed to repeat the acts leading to their deaths? Or, in other stories, why are these victims condemned to hang around where they died? In Western tradition, in particularly religious tradition, a ghost haunts a location as a form of punishment for something they did while alive. But that doesn't seem to be the case for the Phantom Hitchhiker. Well, the simplest answer we could say is that the ghost simply died with things on their mind, tasks undone. Reflecting on any of these stories, it might mean that they died before they could enjoy a simple human pleasure, be it a dance, a wedding, a homecoming. The literal road that they're on now serves as the hitchhiker's personal limbo, eternally traveling to a destination they'll never reach. This introduces us to the Western obsession with the concept of, quote, bad deaths, though the idea of what a bad death is would also change along with the times. For example, during the pre-Reformation, people were very concerned with the, quote, religious loose threads upon death, like if they hadn't had their final rites. So, according to pre-Reformation beliefs, a spirit would be returning to beg for a mass to be spoken for their soul, since they couldn't get into heaven without it. The post-Reformation saw a shift in focus from the religious to the more family-oriented. So now the ghost would be coming back to tell their widow where they'd hidden their savings, because their death had left the family in financial crisis. The guilt would keep them coming back to try to provide the stability for their family that they neglected to take care of while living. The 19th century focused on the personal morals and behavior of the deceased. If they were wicked in life, simply being dead would allow them no respite in the beyond. The 20th century became more about how they died. You've heard it before on countless ghost hunting shows. If a person died a violent or sudden death, the spirit might not understand that they're dead. Bennett contemplates if the Vanishing Hitchhiker might represent the kind of death and afterlife that's most feared by contemporary society. Quote, though they are so blameless, death has selected these people at random. They have had their lives ripped from them by injustice, violence, or accident. They have died separated from their homes and families. And above all, they have died, quote, in the fullness of life, on the threshold of new joys, yet cheated of life's promise. Their endless journeys could be seen as attempts to retrieve what they lost, a quest for life itself. When I said that the Vanishing Hitchhiker touched almost every country, I wasn't kidding. So let's take a round-the-world tour of what this ghost looks like for different cultures and the effects they've had. We'll start our voyage in the Middle East, as it's arguably the location for the first ever Vanishing Hitchhiker story. The New Testament has a story where an angel tells the Apostle Philip to head from Jerusalem down the road south towards Gaza. Not the nicest route, since the text itself describes it as a, quote, wilderness road. Meanwhile, an Ethiopian eunuch is returning home from Jerusalem via chariot. When they cross paths, the Holy Spirit prompts Philip to join the eunuch. Philip runs up to the chariot, and, overhearing the man reading the prophet Isaiah, Philip asks the man, "Do you understand what you're reading?" The Ethiopian responds, "How can I, unless someone guides me?" He invites Philip to take a seat in the chariot with him, and they look over the text. They eventually come upon a body of water, and decide in a spur-of-the-moment decision to have the Apostle Philip baptize the eunuch. But get this. As they come out of the water, quote, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. So Philip just finishes up literally dunking this man underwater, and the Holy Spirit just yanks the poor man through space and time? The stranger blinks the water away, and the man who baptized him is just gone? Not only that, but he kind of just shrugs his shoulders and tap dances along his merry way. It's all kind of hilarious, honestly, but it does have a lot of the bare bones of the Vanishing Hitchhiker legend. While the Vanishing Hitchhiker has been a fairly harmless spirit, Mexico has something more sinister to add. Not only that, but Mexico has decided that there's a kind of trifecta of female spirits that are believed to be related. The first spirit is that of La Muerte, a beautiful woman with just a bare skull for a face. Folklorist Mark Glazer collected examples where La Muerte climbs up behind a horseman for a while. She's also hitched a ride with a cart driver and also accepted a lift from a motorist. Pretty similar. The second spirit that completes the triangle between the hitchhiker and La Muerte is La Llorona. La Llorona, the infamous female spirit who weeps as she drifts along waterways in search of the children that she killed. Variations started to appear in the 19th century, where La Llorona and the Vanishing Hitchhiker were phasing together. Now, I don't want to go into La Muerte or La Llorona in this episode, as those are massive topics on their own, but I'd like to cover them later if people are interested. Shooting across the world, we land in China. Now, full transparency, this story was collected in California, but from Chinese immigrants, and it is a story from their homeland. A man is walking home when a beautiful woman starts to follow behind him. They walk together for quite a while, the young lady taking the position of walking just behind the young man, which is fascinating to me because it mimics where the girl would sit in the car in comparison to the driver. This might just be because there'd be the practical theory that the girl just stepped away to hide, but it's incredibly interesting to have a very similar note between such distant countries. The walk is uneventful. We aren't informed if they have a conversation or if they walk in silence, but when they walk in front of her parents' house, she disappears. I assume that the father sees the confused young man in front of his house, because he comes out to tell the young man that his daughter had been dead for quite some time. Quote, "Yes, that is the precise place where she was killed. It was her spirit that led you here." This story and the story from the Bible are fascinating, because the Vanishing Hitchhiker urban legend is most frequently viewed as a modern urban legend, because of the use of automobiles or cars, since they're fairly modern. But the Chinese version and the chariot story imply that this legend has been evolving for centuries. Paired with the change of transportation, author Nick Harding muses about the possible universal emotional source of the hitchhiker story. Quote, "These tales seem to tap into the idea of lost souls wandering the world, people who have met untimely deaths either on the road or in war." For context, sometimes a hitchhiker is a soldier returning from war. Meandering south, we have Haruo Aoki of UCLA, who heard about a Korean hitchhiking ghost in 1941. The story is so similar to American variants that it suggests the cross-culturalization between Korea and the US. At midnight, a Guntaku cab company driver is summoned to the municipal crematory. He picks up a 20-year-old woman in front of the crematory, who instructs him to take her to Mr. Shimo's hardware store on Meiji Street. Interestingly, our reporter, Haruo Aoki, interjects that his own grandmother was a good friend of Mr. and Mrs. Shimo, and that they recalled this exact incident. As the cab arrives, the girl tells the driver that she doesn't have money to pay for the fare and asks him to wait while she goes inside to get some money. Since Mr. Shimo was well known in the community as an upstanding citizen, the driver agrees. But after an extended amount of time, he had no choice but to knock on the door. A sleepy Mrs. Shimo eventually answers, confused by his story, until the driver describes his passenger. Mrs. Shimo steps aside to show the driver a picture of her own daughter on the wall. She tragically died a few days before, her body being sent to the crematory he picked her up from. The end of the story takes a final twist when the taxi driver becomes fatally ill after this revelation. And now to Russia. So we've seen in dozens of stories, including the one we just heard, where the ghost of the passenger is identified by a portrait. Brunvand traces the origins of this trope back to modern-day Leningrad, from an account dated to December 16, 1890. On Sergivsky Street, a priest arrives at an apartment after Mass. A young man answers the door, and the priest tells him that he'd been instructed to visit this apartment. The young man doesn't know what he's talking about, as he's the only one who lives there. The priest insists that a lady had approached him after Mass, gave him the address, and told him to give the sacraments to the man who lives in the apartment. The priest leans over, pointing at a woman's portrait on the wall. Quote, "Look, that is the very woman who asked me to come." The young man pales. "That is the portrait of my dead mother." I didn't think the insistence of the mother's spirit to get a priest to say the sacraments over her young son boded well. And it turns out I was right. Not a day after taking communion, the young man was dead. Africa has quite a few vanishing hitchhiker stories, specifically in South Africa, as reported by John Johnson. 41-year-old Mr. Anthony Lagrange is driving along Uniondale-Willamore Road on May 1st, 1976. It's about 7:15 p.m. when a dark-haired girl comes into view. She's wearing a duffel coat and slacks, standing on the side of the road. Though she isn't actively hitchhiking, it was raining, so Lagrange stops to give her a lift. She's gone when they reach the destination, yada yada yada. But Lagrange is so upset by this encounter that he bursts into the Uniondale police station and demands the assistance of Officer Cornelius Pogiter, who naturally shows him the door. But here's where it gets interesting. Lagrange starts driving home, but apparently the ghost was still around and she wasn't happy. A hysterical scream echoes inside his car, so terrifying that Lagrange pulls a 180 and speeds back to the station. This time, he wouldn't take no for an answer. Just as Lagrange is reaching the station, the right rear car door slowly opens and closes with the timing of someone getting out of the car. Lagrange slams his car to a stop, and fortunately a policeman had been walking towards the car and witnessed the door's movement. The only thing Lagrange manages to say is, quote, "How about that? How about that?" over and over again, trying to calm himself. But the two men had to admit that there really wasn't anything the cop could do for him. Lagrange later saw a photo of a girl who'd been killed on that same road. The face looked far too similar to Lagrange. National serviceman Douwe van Jaarsveld is riding his motorcycle near Uniondale, South Africa, on his way to visit his girlfriend on March 31st, 1978. At 9:35 p.m., he spots a girl on the side of the road. He stops to offer her a ride, and we actually get the incredibly rare first-hand account here. Quote, "The girl climbed on my bike and we started off. As I rode along, I started to get really cold, unnaturally so. I accelerated to about 120 kilometers per hour, and then I felt something bumping lightly against my back. Then the rear wheel slithered slightly on the road, and I had a momentary struggle to stabilize it. I glanced in the rearview mirror to see if the girl was all right, and she wasn't there. I thought she had fallen off, and I swung my bike in a U-turn to go back and look for her. I was really frightened. I must have gone about 2 kilometers before I realized I was still feeling the gentle bumping against my back. I looked round and found that the bumping was caused by my spare helmet, which was clipped to the luggage rack. Then I got a real fright, and I took off like a bullet. I touched 190 kilometers per hour on my way to Uniondale." Uniondale magistrate Andries Vermeulen launched an investigation into the incident and concluded that the ghost really did exist. Though what the evidence was for that conclusion, I have no idea. However, this story sounds incredibly similar to another biker variant of the Vanishing Hitchhiker. This blonde hitchhiker was known as, quote, "the motorcycle ghost," notorious for making an appearance in the Karoo Desert. But this girl doesn't bother with a standard greeting. Instead of being offered a ride, she simply appears behind rider André Chiozzi. Her activity had been noted for the past 10 years, and it was believed that she was a woman killed when she fell from a motorcycle in a crash near Banderas turnoff. Chiozzi said, quote, "I felt my hair stand on end inside my crash helmet, and something put its arms around my waist from behind. there was something sitting on my bike. Kyotsi said he never got a look at his passenger, who beat him atop his helmet for a while prior to inexplicably disappearing when he hit 100 miles per hour. Well, that's the first time we've heard of a hitchhiking ghost slapping the driver. Mr. Johnson was in Somalia in 1987 and was asked to give a lecture on folklore at the Somalia National University. Afterwards, a student approached him and told this story. Ali spent 4 years completing his BA in the United States as his girlfriend Faduma awaited his return in Somalia. After finishing his degree, he flew back to the coastal capital of Mogadishu, reuniting with Faduma. Ali and Faduma decide to celebrate by going to the Al Aruba Hotel to dance at the basement nightclub. It's late when they leave, walking along the beach. It's a chilly night, so Ali gives her his jacket, draping it over her shoulders. They eventually part ways to return home. The next morning, Ali goes over to Faduma's house to retrieve his jacket. Her father answers the door, surprised but delighted to see him. He invites the young man in, bringing the whole family in to greet him. After exchanging some happy pleasantries, Ali asks where Faduma is, assuming she'd slept in after their late night. Her father goes still, his face falls. Quote, "Oh, Ali, I have very bad news. Faduma was killed in a car crash 2 years ago. I am sorry to greet you with these sad tidings." Ali shouts, quote, "Impossible. I spent the whole day with her yesterday. We even went to the Al Aruba nightclub last evening. I have her letters for the past 4 years." I really perked up at this. 2 years of letters from a deceased loved one? That wasn't an unexplained single evening. That was a substantial amount of time he was in contact with a ghost. But of course, they never actually bring the letters out or discuss them in any way. The story ends with Ali's would-be father-in-law driving him to the cemetery to show him her grave, but they're both shocked when they find Ali's coat lying on the stone. This story was later adapted into Arthur Goldstruck's book, The Rabbit in the Thorn Tree, in 1990. Professor Johnson brings up a good question. Why is the Vanishing Hitchhiker thriving in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, unfortunately, because Africa has been the victim of colonialism so frequently over the course of history, it means that the country, particularly along the coast, is much more exposed to outside influences and stories. Africa has also become more and more urbanized since the 60s, which means that a lot of people from different areas and traditions have combined into metropolitan areas. But Africa also has a deep connection and belief in the spiritual. Sub-Saharan African tradition also cherishes its ancestors, and its people hold grief closely. This, combined with a good part of the population believing in beings such as ghosts, means that a story like The Vanishing Hitchhiker would easily be embraced by the cultural zeitgeist. Now, over in Japan, there's a lot going on. We'll start with a simple version of The Vanishing Hitchhiker, where a spirit hitches a ride in Kyoto. She summons a cab out in front of Hakuai Kai Hospital, where she died. She asks to be taken to the University of Kyoto Medical School, as her own body had been sent there as a dissection cadaver. When the taxi driver turns to find his passenger missing, he also sees the seat she was in is wet. Well, the small Midoro pond is near Hakuai Kai Hospital. It certainly suggests a connection to the wet footprints occasionally found in or around the car in American versions of the story. It's also an interesting detail that the spirit seems preoccupied not with finding family, but her body. We did see this with ghosts who asked to be taken to the graveyard, but maybe this acknowledges the fear that many cultures have when it comes to what happens to the body and soul after death, once separated. Almost every culture has very specific practices about what you're supposed to do with the body after death, and the consequences for not following those rules. It also echoes the distrust that many have shown in history, that someone might not respect their wishes for what should be done with their body. The story confirms this fear, that the soul is unable to move on without the proper treatment of her remains. On March 11th, 2011, a triple disaster ripped through the coast of Tohoku. A 9.0 magnitude earthquake caused a tsunami, both of which destabilized the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which melted down. Over 20,000 people were killed. Trees, cars, buildings, people were washed away. Ishinomaki was hit the hardest, racking up almost a quarter of the total casualties. This left a deep scar on the psyche of Japan at large, let alone in the affected areas. While the aftershock of these tragedies continued to rock the country, odd reports started coming in. Reports of ghostly phenomena were popping up after the Great East Japan earthquake, particularly along the coast of the disaster zone, and a ton of the reports were from taxi drivers. In June, a taxi driver waited for a customer near JR Ishinomaki Station. A woman in her 30s got in, wearing a fluffy coat that would be much more suitable for the winter, certainly not for midsummer. All she said was Minamihama. The driver was suspicious. The area had been devastated in the tsunami, and he gently tried to tell her that it was almost vacant at that point. The response from the ghost was heartbreaking. "Am I dead?" And she was gone. A Sendai taxi picked up a depressed-looking man who gave an address. The driver was confused, and he didn't really know how to tell the man that that address no longer existed. He started driving anyway. Halfway through the trip, he looked in the rearview mirror, and the man had disappeared. He decided to finish the trip anyway, pulling up to the foundations of a house that had been ripped away. The driver got out, walked around, and opened the passenger door of the seat the man had been sitting in, and politely waited, allowing the spirit to leave the taxi and go to his former home. In August 2013, a taxi driver spotted a very unusual customer. A small elementary school girl dressed in a coat, hat, scarf, and boots stood there. Again, clothes that were way too warm for August. The driver was concerned. "Miss, where are your mom and dad?" She told him she was alone. Still worried, he asked for her address to take her home, which she gave. They arrived at their destination. The driver got out, walked around, and offered her a hand to help her get out. She took his hand. "Thank you, uncle." And then she was gone. University student Yuka Kudo chose to do field research in Ishinomaki as her graduation thesis, focusing on the paranormal activity that occurred after the disaster. The reaction to her questions varied greatly, from aggression to gratitude for having someone to talk to. Many of the taxi drivers felt like they had to hide their experiences from colleagues, family, and friends. And movingly, they had silently been paying for the fares of the customers who had disappeared on their routes. But taxi drivers weren't the only witnesses. Mere months after the disaster, residents were calling the police at night. They reported seeing people with miserable faces, drenched in water, appearing and disappearing under the streetlights of Ishinomaki. The baffled authorities had no other suggestion than to remove the lights altogether. An old Onagawa woman who died in the tsunami was returning to her neighbor's house to sit down for a cup of tea. But the neighbors, they'd leave a cushion out for her. When she disappeared, the cushion was soaked with seawater. In Tagajo, a fire station received call after call from the same number. Eventually, a crew of firefighters drove to the ruins of the caller's house and prayed for the building's dead. And the calls stopped. Author Richard Perry met the chief priest of a Zen temple in the inland town of Korihara, who had exorcised the spirits of people who drowned in the tsunami. Within a month, Reverend Kaneda had performed 200 funerals. And this certainly wasn't isolated to Reverend Kaneda's practice. Christian priests, Shinto priests, and Buddhist monks were overwhelmed by the restless spirits and the bereaved survivors. Quote, "They didn't cry," Kaneda said. "There was no emotion at all. The loss was so profound, and death had come so suddenly. They understood the facts of their situation individually, that they had lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, and lost their families. They understood each piece, but they couldn't see it as a whole, and they couldn't understand what they should do, or sometimes even where they were." But eventually, the wary, defensive ice began to chip away. Survivors started to talk about the terror of the tsunami itself, the pain of their grief, their fears for the future. Then they eventually described ghostly strangers, friends, neighbors, and loved ones. Hauntings had no boundaries. Home, work, offices, public areas, beaches, and in the ruined, drowned towns. This was accompanied by eerie dreams, a suffocating fog of anxiety, and even possessions. Quote, "A young man complained of pressure on his chest at night, as if some creature was straddling him as he slept. A teenage girl spoke of a fearful figure who squatted in her house. A middle-aged man hated to go out in the rain because of the eyes of the dead, which stared out at him from puddles. A civil servant in Soma visited a devastated stretch of coast and saw a solitary woman in a scarlet dress, far from the nearest road or house, with no means of transport in sight. When he looked for her again, she had disappeared." And so many bodies of the dead weren't found, which made it impossible to mourn in the usual culturally acceptable ways. This certainly led to a suffocating amount of guilt, that the souls of their community were trapped. Quote, "So many died, and all at once, at home, at work, at school. The wave came in, and they were gone. The dead had no time to prepare themselves. The people left behind had no time to say goodbye. Those who lost their families and those who died, they have strong feelings of attachment. The dead are attached to the living, and those who have lost them are attached to the dead. It's inevitable that there are ghosts." The conclusion of what exactly these spirits were was varied. A good number believed that this was the power of the kami, the Japanese word for deity. It was concluded by most that these ghosts were the manifestation of the trauma that had been experienced, either by the ghost as they died or by the people who survived. A horrible, sad connection between the living and the dead. Their spirits had lost everything: their place in the world, their living body, and the spot where their body should have rested, with the appropriate burial rites. Professor Hara Takahashi of Tohoku University interviewed health practitioners and priests about the paranormal effects of the disaster. He believes that, quote, "their experiences left the strong impression that the deceased had not fully passed to the other side. Rather, they were living their afterlives in the same space as the living, blurring the boundaries of these two places." Ghosts and hauntings are incredibly poignant in Japan. And in general, ghosts kind of break our understanding of reality. They're ripples and snags in time and space, balancing between history and the present, the physically tangible and the ethereal. Quote, "Ishinomaki is filled with those invisible stories and their effective charge. Not only the dead, but mourning itself, mourning for a lost place and a lost time that can never be again, have a weight. Against our will, hauntings show what is still missing, the invisible that needs to be addressed, the, quote, endings that are not over." In Japanese tradition, when they handle ghosts, people pray to send their souls to the other shore by telling the ghosts, quote, "Don't come again," or "Go to the other world." But the areas affected by the Great East Japan earthquake have changed that immediate reaction. Quote, The surviving family members of the deceased look forward to their return with a sense of awe and quietly welcomed them. Author Kiyoshi Kanabishi asserts that he didn't seek to figure out if ghosts were real or not, but rather the reactions of people. He asked a taxi driver what he felt when he realized he had a spirit in his car. Quote, "At first I was just scared and couldn't move for a while." But he also said, quote, "It's not so strange now. A lot of people died in the earthquake, right? It's natural for some people to have regrets about this world. I don't feel afraid anymore. And if I see someone waiting for a taxi wearing out-of-season winter clothes again, I'll treat her like a normal customer." Writing this section in particular really affected me. A chain of disasters is already emotionally devastating enough. But to see evidence of your loved ones or members of your neighborhood are still there, confused, lost, and frightened, searching for comfort, it sounds almost too much to bear. And it's not just one spirit. It's wave after wave of reports, portions of entire communities calling out to be seen and laid to rest. This was so harrowing to research, but it was the actions of the living that impacted me even more. The taxi drivers quietly paying the fare of their disappearing passengers. The driver choosing to finish the route and hold the door open for a spirit at the foundations of his home. The neighbor that keeps a pillow out for an old friend now gone. Although it's uncomfortable and sad to be face to face with the death of innocence, particularly of those you knew and loved, these people are silently showing that they still value the needs and memory of the dead. They don't really have to. There's no reward for doing it. But these echoes of people are people. And they matter so much to the living that they'll face that discomfort over and over to try to erase theirs. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever read about a topic that's just so sad.
How many people do you know who actually pick up hitchhikers anymore? I feel like this is a story that's probably not in active use. I think it's more of a recent historical narrative because people don't pick up hitchhikers. Taxi drivers and Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, that's who picks up strangers.
So in an age where no one really hitchhikes, why does the Vanishing Hitchhiker live on? Barbara Mickelson suggested that the obsession with the story comes from the idea of an accidental encounter with the paranormal. It's a pretty thrilling idea that anyone could encounter the supernatural at any time, anywhere, night or day. And sure, on the surface, that could certainly be true. But I think The Vanishing Hitchhiker is much more about the difficulty of letting go. Now, that might sound a little stupid or obvious. I mean, they're ghosts. That's their entire thing. But this one reaches deeper than the usual ghost story. The ghosts repeat the same path, unable to accept that their future is gone. How can it be? They were so young, they were just starting to date, heading home to see family, about to get married. Simply being young, it can feel like those experiences are owed to us, and it can make us feel invincible. I have a life to live here. I have people here who need me. I can hardly blame a person's soul to not know how to move past that. And the struggle of letting go certainly doesn't only belong to the spirits of the dead. Almost all of us have lost someone, and if we're being cripplingly honest with ourselves, no amount of time with them was ever going to be enough. Whether it's the daughter ready to spin the night away at a dance, a partner we always intended to return to, or a grandmother we used to have coffee with, no amount of time was ever going to be enough. But what if you had one more night? One night where you're still unburdened by the knowledge of their fate. And even if this person is a stranger, this ghost in disguise, the fact that we know what it feels like to lose someone means that we understand the grief of the family, the poor family, opening the door to countless strangers who all bring the same message, that your loved one is doing everything in their power to reach across the fabric of time, space, and nature to get back to you. They might have been just on the other side of the door when the universe pulled them away. Grief is one of the emotions that unites us in the strongest yet most crippling ways. From the biblical Middle East to the backroads of the United States to modern-day Japan, this story unites our humanity, our capacity to love, and our inevitability to lose. And it reminds us to treasure every moment with everyone that we can. Well, this has been one of the hardest conclusions I've written, and I didn't really expect this episode to get as emotional as it did. But to be honest, I think writing this kind of helps. I won't ever forget the people I've lost. But it's kind of comforting that so many people out there in the world, and across time, other than myself, care so deeply for the dead, who believe that their emotions and legacy still matters, despite them not being here anymore. But next week, we move on. The next episode is actually about a legend group, a collection of multiple legend types. The setting for this legend means that they aren't discussed as frequently anymore, but we'll learn why that is, as well as how those stories are evolving. So tell me, when was the last time you went to the mall? 'Cause we'll meet there next week. Bye.